Okay. So welcome to the Poudre River Fest. We are in day 3 of this year's hybrid event. Everything we're talking about today is all about water. So how water is a part of our everyday life, whether that is drinking water, water for our gardens, how we use water to, make sure that our homes are beautiful. This afternoon, we have a great presentation about the importance of clean water and the production of beer, which I'm very excited to hear more about. But right now, our next presentation is Green Infrastructure for Resilient Cities, and we have Stacey from US EPA with us to do that presentation. Just a reminder, the Poudre River Fest is organized by 6 organizations in the Fort Collins community. These are the organizations that are behind the scenes putting on the event for you. Proceeds from the Poudre River Fest go to support restoration projects on the Cache La Poudre River. So if you are interested in donating or learning more, please visit poudreriverfest.org. Our final day for this year's hybrid version of the festival is Saturday, August 21st at New Belgium Brewery. And hopefully at that event, we'll be able to announce what our restoration project is going to be for this upcoming year. And we're actually pooling our funds from 2020's event and 2021. So hopefully we'll have a big, nice number to be able to announce and show how we are going to be restoring the Poudre River. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I am going to hand it over to Stacey.
Hi, everybody. I'm Stacey Eriksen with EPA Region 8 in Denver. And let me see, I'm trying to share my screen and it's seems to be locking up. Let me try again. Hi, Laura. It's not letting me, the share button is not highlighting and it's not letting me click it.
Okay, give me 1 second. And I actually have your presentation, so I can also share it from my screen, if that is helpful for you.
Okay, I think
there you
that
go.
just
I think
did
you
it.
got it.
I think we got it. And okay, does that look correct, Laura?
Yeah, it looks perfect.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. I'm Stacey Eriksen with EPA Region 8 in Denver, and we cover a 6-state region: Colorado, Utah, Montana, Wyoming, and North and South Dakota. And I am the Green Infrastructure Coordinator, as well as the Urban Waters Coordinator and the Land Revitalization Coordinator in Region 8 Denver. I'm actually split between our water program and our Brownfields program. And the first photo that you're seeing on the first slide is actually EPA's green roof at our building in downtown Denver near Union Station. It's got sedums on it, fairly early green roof in the city of Denver. The number of Region 8 resources that folks on this call might be interested in are climate adaptation and sustainable communities person. We have a disaster recovery and resiliency coordinator, Green Infrastructure Coordinator, which is me. We have a Water Sense Coordinator, an Energy Star Coordinator, and a Green Building and Renewable Energy Coordinator in our region. I think these tend to be some of the less known things that EPA does. All of these programs are voluntary and are not part of any of our regulatory work. We have a number of partnerships that we work on with a lot of different federal agencies. These are just a few of them. I've worked on the Partnership for Sustainable Communities and the Urban Waters Federal Partnership, and also worked with some folks at the Corps of Engineers on their Silver Jackets program, and there's a few other things in there. Our Water Sense program, if you haven't heard about it, is very similar to Energy Star except for water fixtures. So it helps save water. The fixtures generally are more efficient than the average product, and it actually there are also projects products for landscape irrigation, and that's how it fits into this presentation. Communities are facing a lot of different challenges, dealing with stormwater and trash in the stormwater, excess volume and velocity that causes flooding and erosion, drought conditions that creates high runoff rates when it eventually rains, and then development that tends to increase impervious cover and stormwater volumes. This slide basically is a graph that shows that the more impervious surface, concrete and asphalt that you have, the more degraded a watershed becomes. Once you get up past about 25%, it starts becoming fairly degraded. Improving the approach to managing stormwater is really important. Typical stormwater, it's designed to move the stormwater quickly off-site, sort of treats stormwater as a waste product, but trying to rethink that by using low-impact development or green infrastructure, views stormwater as a resource, helps manage the stormwater on-site, reduces pollutant loads, and also creates multifunctional infrastructure. Basically, green infrastructure are systems and practices that mimic natural processes to infiltrate, evapotranspirate, or reuse stormwater. It can be used at a lot of different landscape scales. In our region, and here in Colorado, we have a lot of large-scale green infrastructure. U.S. Forest Service land provides a lot of our drinking water for the Denver metro area, so source water protection of that existing green infrastructure is important, but also there are other types of green infrastructure that can be re-added back into urban communities. The photo that you see there is actually Westerly Creek at the former Stapleton International Airport, which is now called Central Park. And that is a daylighted creek that used to flow in culverts underneath taxiways. Low impact development and green infrastructure get used a little bit interchangeably. There's some slight differences in there, but basically it's trying to re-envision land use planning and trying to use a pre-development hydrologic regime so that we have more natural functions. It's sustainable. It can be added to new developments and also to redevelopments. It tends to be less expensive when you add it in on the front end rather than the back end. And the photo that you see there is actually a stormwater retention area behind the Northfield Shopping Center in Denver, behind the Super Target. It collects stormwater runoff from the Northfield Shopping Center and also from Interstate 70. And it's a great place for habitat for coyotes and a lot of different types of birds. Green infrastructure will have a bigger impact when it's holistically integrated with other infrastructure, and multi-benefit infrastructure is more cost effective. And since governments never have enough money and are always looking for things, if you can try to create that multifunctional infrastructure, it's really helpful. And the photo you see there is actually in Fort Collins near the Springer Natural Area. That's actually a bioswale that accepts runoff from a parking lot that includes some permeable pavement. It's also a pretty attractive looking bioswale. Green infrastructure helps build resiliency. And so dealing with things around flooding, climate change, those sorts of things, urban heat island effect, it has a big impact on that. Basically, green infrastructure helps slow down stormwater, spread it out, and soak it in. It can be used in a lot of different places: parks and open space, urban forestry, parking lot landscaping requirements, climate adaptation strategies, resilience strategies, and flood restoration. And the top photo there is Greenway Park during a flood event in the Central Park neighborhood, and shows how it actually functions the way it's supposed to. It doesn't flood any houses. And the lower photo is actually a parking lot in the city of Boulder, and you can see that there's a bunch of cuts there that drain water from the parking lot into the parking lot landscaping. Lots of different types of green infrastructure, and this is not a comprehensive list of all of the terms. There's a lot of different terms used. Green roofs and planter boxes and rain gardens and bioswales, different types of porous pavements. There's rainwater harvesting, cisterns, and rain barrels. And then there's more natural types of green infrastructure, such as wetlands and riparian areas. And the top photo is the conference center for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City, and that is a green roof. And then on the bottom down there is a bioswale at Fort Carson, Colorado. Green infrastructure is really important to manage stormwater, also for climate adaptation, urban heat island reduction, biodiversity. It actually improves air quality. It helps clean water. It helps create healthy soils. It's great for recreation and also for quality of life. And the top photo that you see there is the taxi redevelopment in the River North area, Rhino, of Denver. And that is just off of their parking lot behind the Taxi One building. And you can see it looks really beautiful. And I don't think a lot of folks know that that is actually there to manage stormwater. And the bottom photo is another bioswale at Fort Carson, Colorado. A lot of additional benefits from green infrastructure, reduced stormwater runoff, groundwater recharge, pollutant reductions. We don't have any sewer overflows in the state of Colorado, but in other parts of the country, that's important. Carbon sequestration, reduced energy, wildlife habitat, increased land values. Permeable pavements can actually have less splash and spray and ponding and noise and pollutants coming off of them. If you look at long-term costs, green infrastructure can actually be less expensive than gray infrastructure. It's a lot prettier to look at, and it makes communities more resilient. And the photo you see there is actually Colorado State University. It's on the plaza right near the Student Center. And it's a permeable pavement system, and actually it functions quite well. A lot of different ways that you can incorporate green infrastructure depending on planning or other things in a town. And I'm not going to go into reading all of these, but looking at ordinances and incentives and building codes and shared parking and promoting tree canopy and riparian setbacks can be really important ways that you can help incorporate green infrastructure. And the photo that you see there is actually in Central Park in Denver. That used to be under some taxiways. That's 29th Avenue, and that's we've got some green infrastructure and a running path there. One of the biggest considerations for green infrastructure is operations and maintenance. This is one of the things that tends to concern a lot of public works departments because it's a different kind of green infrastructure than what they've typically been used to doing. Fort Collins is actually very good at this. Fort Collins has a really good low impact development ordinance. But the green infrastructure needs to be monitored for infiltration and drainage, needs to be pruned and mowed. You have to deal with mulch, watering and fertilizing it, replacing dead plants, looking at inlets and outlets and under drains if you have those. All that has to be done at different frequencies. And the photo that you see there is Greenway Park. I showed a photo of that earlier during a flood event. This is actually in the fall. And this is a good demonstration of, it doesn't need irrigation now, but it did when it first started for about the first 3 years in order to get that green infrastructure established. This is a tool from EPA. It's called GWiz, or Green Infrastructure Wizard. If you Google it, you can pull that up. It actually is a pretty intuitive to use website that is really helpful in helping access some of EPA's green infrastructure information. These are some national websites and tools. I think Laura's going to have a copy of my slides if folks want access to any of this. We have a semi-arid green infrastructure webpage on there. If you Google EPA green infrastructure, it'll pull up headquarters website, and we're a subset off of the landing page there. There's also a stormwater calculator. There's an international stormwater BMP database of best management practices and some monitoring. There's a barriers document, and there's also a listserv that comes out of our headquarters office. And the photo you see there is actually the National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden. That is a stormwater retention pond with some created wetlands and some stone gabion walls. These are some of the Western websites. I mentioned our semi-arid green infrastructure webpage. Mile High Flood District in the Denver metro area has their Volume 3 criteria manual, which a lot of our states and localities actually tend to model a lot of their criteria manuals after Mile High Flood District, and they're a great resource for a lot of folks. The Denver Ultra-Urban Green Infrastructure Guidelines, they will be part of the next Volume 3 criteria manual. And those are kind of some ready, set, approved things in the city and county of Denver, but I know a lot of other folks have been looking at those. There's some Denver's Green Building Ordinance, and there's a Green Infrastructure Guide to Downtown Colorado, and a number of other sites. And the photos you see there along the South Platte River and show different types of green infrastructure along that area near Shoemaker Plaza. Green infrastructure in the semi-arid West is a little bit different because of the small amount of precipitation, the amount of sunshine, infrequent intense storms, and green infrastructure looks a little different here than it looks on the coast. It tends to look a little bit more taupe or brown. And the photo you see there is actually a sod roof in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. What's different about the West, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have hardly any combined sewer overflows. So we don't have enforcement actions that can compel municipalities to do green infrastructure. So in our region, green infrastructure is more of a voluntary approach, although it is part of some municipalities' municipal separate storm sewer permits if they have one. Another thing that's different is prior appropriation, Western water law, and that someone else owns that water. We tend to have a lot of clay soils, so it's really important to design and engineer for infiltration. Site-specific design and installations important, having experienced installers, irrigation to get plants established, and choosing the right plants to begin with. And the photo that you see there is the former Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver, and they had a green roof. As I mentioned, plant selection is really key. Natives are preferred. Kentucky bluegrass is not great for semi-arid climates due to the water use, the shallow roots, and the amount of herbicides and pesticides that are typically used. If you're doing green infrastructure along roadways, having salt-tolerant plants can be really important. Conifers tend to be less salt-tolerant. And the photo you see there is Westerly Creek, again in the Central Park neighborhood. You can kind of see some houses off in the distance and some sculptures and some other things along the Westerly Creek stream bank. A few barriers in our region. There's some perceptions about design, construction, and maintenance costs. There's a lot of new data out there that looks at that. A lot of mixed messages and lack of connections from different government agencies and departments. Misperception around economics. Not having the kind of integration into regional and site planning. Lack of trust in anything new. And then the irrigation needs. And the photo at the top is again in Central Park in Denver. That's the median along 29th Avenue again. And at the bottom, that's actually at Odell Brewery. This one doesn't have the really established plants. The last time I was up there, it was not raining and there were so many cars in the parking lot, I couldn't get a more updated photo, but it shows you basically how the permeable pavements can direct any excess water into some areas where you have plants. These are some photos of Brighton Boulevard in Denver, Colorado, and they use some planter boxes and some stone gabion wall benches. And you can see that some of the stormwater is directed from the street, basically through an area into those planter boxes. Also in Denver, the photo on the left is actually a permeable pavement green alley behind a food hall. And the photo on the right is a planter box, and you can also see that some of the sidewalk, the rainwater that comes off of that is directed into that planter box. This is in Fort Collins, Colorado. You can see some really nice bioswales, and then some areas where it can overflow into a system, storm sewer system, if it gets too high. I've got some photos coming up of universities and some of their green infrastructure. This is CSU in Fort Collins. Similar picture to what I showed you earlier. This is a permeable paver area that functions quite well. It's right near the Clark building. I don't recall the name of the building that's there in the background. And then over on the right, you can see an area where there is rainwater that is directed from that building through a dry creek bed into a bioswale, and then you've got an overflow into some gray infrastructure. This is CU in Boulder. They've got a great area taking some of the roof runoff, directing that also into a dry creek bed, and some really nice plant material there. This is Metropolitan State University in Denver and some of their green infrastructure. The top photo is kind of a gathering place, amphitheater sort of area with a lot of green infrastructure around it. And on the lower right, you can see rainwater is directed from the street off into a rock area and then down into some plant material and a swale. This is the University of Wyoming in Laramie, and this is a green roof. It's quite a bit more established than this photo shows. This was fairly early after it was planted. This is some photos of the University of Utah Law School in Salt Lake City. They've got a lot of planter boxes, it's a very green building overall. They've got a lot of solar panels, and then they've also got some rain gardens and some other things that I don't have photos of, but they did a lot of sustainable redevelopment there. And the next photos I'm going to show you are about some community-driven design projects that EPA has been involved in. This is South Lincoln Homes, which was an affordable housing complex that ended up being redeveloped into affordable housing and market rate housing. We ended up doing a series of 3 design charrettes. One of them was around green infrastructure and stormwater. And you can see the before picture on the left and the after picture on the right of what the community now looks like. This is right near the 10th and Osage light rail station. As I mentioned, we did some design charrettes. This redevelopment was actually an EPA Smart Growth Achievement Award. There's a great video, and there's some information in a report that sort of summarizes what happened in those design charrettes. It's actually on Denver Housing Authority's website. Here's some more photos of the green infrastructure that ended up being installed in all of the phases that were put in. So you can see some porous landscape detention, some permeable pavements, and some nice planter boxes. A few lessons learned from the design charrettes. Taking a holistic approach always works better. They really looked beyond their site boundaries into how stormwater was managed on adjacent streets and other areas, trying to identify all the stakeholders up front, looking at priorities and trade-offs, defining clear goals and metrics, collaborating with all the different players was really helpful to have that upfront collaboration to see what was possible. Innovative solutions may require a little bit of research and testing. Environmental conditions, any site contamination, brownfields issues may affect the types of green infrastructure that may be chosen. And having cost estimates up front really helps you implement it later. This is Westerly Creek in New Freedom Park. It's a different part of Westerly Creek. It's actually in between Central Park, formerly Stapleton, and the Lowry redevelopment. It's an area with a lot of affordable housing. The creek actually goes underground into the city of Aurora. It was rather unsafe with a lot of riprap. A lot of kids played in here, and so on the top you can see the before pictures, and then the sketch of how it was re-envisioned, and on the bottom you can see how it looks currently, with really nice vegetation and a low water crossing. This was basically a park that Trust for Public Land was working with the city of Denver on a property that the city owned, and working with the affordable housing providers because there weren't parks in that area. They redesigned the park. However, they didn't have money to do anything about the creek, and that's where EPA's funding came in. We had a whole lot of people working on this and some really terrific partners, and some really great community meetings. Trust for Public Land, as I mentioned, started with the park design, and we worked closely with them in the redesign of Westerly Creek. And here you can see one of the community meetings with a lot of different folks. We were very lucky to have somebody that could actually translate for some of the folks. We ended up having to do a meeting with a lot of multi-voting with dots around photos because we did have a lot of non-English speakers there. This is one of the first projects I've ever worked on where we had a kids component, and that's Donnie Roush, formerly with Earth Force. He's now with Denver Wastewater, and actually working with kids to see what they wanted about the creek. And they had very specific ideas about what they wanted to see. And it ends up, it's a very well-used park. And it's also got an urban garden next to it, and created a great space for everybody there. Kids were really important to the event. A small amount of money leveraged a lot more money. It costs a fair amount of money in order to do that stream restoration. Some of it was funded through the city of Denver, some through Mile High Flood District, and some through a natural resource damage claim settlement. And good consultants make things run smoothly, and you can see Mayor Michael Hancock there at the ribbon cutting. This was some work that we worked with the Greenway Foundation on the River Vision implementation plan. They basically did some Greenway master plans and then created a River Vision implementation plan. And 3 of the projects we ended up working with them and the public on, and the city of Denver. We also worked with the city of Denver on a corridor-wide planning project looking at brownfield sites in 5 catalytic properties along the South Platte River. Here's one of the properties. This is Weir Gulch at Sun Valley. This is Denver Housing Authority's current redevelopment project that came after the Mariposa project. Weir Gulch was originally a concrete lined trapezoidal channel. You can see the photo up there on the left of when they ripped out the concrete, and you can see the next photo near the top of what it looked like after some of the vegetation came in. There were some drop structures put in order to drop out sediment before it goes into the South Platte River. And it was very cool. As soon as they ripped out the concrete, we started getting wildlife in there. There was a turtle and some crawdads and deer coming down that hadn't come down there before. Sun Valley is being redeveloped into what they call an eco district, and so they're looking at energy solutions and also green infrastructure for managing their stormwater. You can see a before picture and some after conceptual drawings of what they hope it will look like when it's built out. This was a study that we did on evaluating 4 different options for managing stormwater on one site and looking at upfront capital costs, annual operating costs, and the 20-year net present value of those costs, and basically showing that the greenest option was the least expensive over a 20-year period and was was almost the least expensive when it came to upfront capital costs. This is Johnson Habitat Park in Denver. It's a big regional park. The Greenway Foundation has their South Platte River Environmental Education headquarters right nearby, and there's a lot of really cool things there and a lot of green infrastructure that manages some of the stormwater runoff from the site before it goes into the South Platte River. This was a project with the Urban Land Conservancy at the 38th and Blake Transit-Oriented Development Light Rail Station, basically looking at green infrastructure, potential green infrastructure on that site. Looking at different examples, they were able to demonstrate if they wanted to build that they could manage actually all of the stormwater from a 100-year storm event on site. This just shows you the engineering that goes into like trying to figure out how much stormwater you need to infiltrate. Same thing, shows you some different things and different types of green infrastructure practices and how much water storage volume they can get from that. This project was in the Westwood neighborhood, which is over off of Morrison Road, a large immigrant community that lives there. There was an old service station that a nonprofit organization, Buku West, wanted to turn into some micro business space, and they wanted to create a plaza nearby with some green infrastructure with a stage that allowed for artists and community programming events. And so a lot of brownfield sites along this, there were a lot of former service stations and gas stations along Morrison Road. Urban Land Conservancy has affordable housing nearby, and Trust for Public Land was working on their climate smart cities, and also something they call a Via Verde, trying to put in more green infrastructure to create safe walking spaces and safe routes to school, and then trying to integrate all that with a linear mercado along Morrison Road. The design of this had a plaza as a catalyst for the community and created a community space. They also did some traffic calming and closing down one street and creating a shared street in the design. They're still working on moving this forward. And it had a bioswale and rain garden buffers and some permeable pavers as part of the design. This is a project in Glenwood Springs at the confluence of two rivers, and basically it's an old wastewater treatment plant and a brownfield site, and it's looking at a regional park and trying to manage stormwater on that site and creating a space for the public. This is a project in Canyon City. It's a former monastery. This shows you the three concepts that were part of the design charrette with the public. This was our first virtual event because of COVID. I'm trying to get public input, but we went through three possible designs, and then the community stakeholders picked out the pieces that they liked the best out of each design, and then we came up with a final design, basically trying to keep all of the great aspects in these historic buildings that were the monastery. There's a nearby winery, and trying to actually expand access for that, trying to create lots of different housing types, and then trying to manage stormwater from the site by expanding an existing stormwater retention area and turning it into an open space, and then also using some wildflowers to create some green infrastructure near the winery. Big takeaways from community-driven design is the community lives there. They come up with great ideas and they know what they want. It's helpful having their input so that you can get a design that you can later go look for funding, and that you have the support of the community and the folks in the municipality. Maintenance is important to figure out and design that in on the front end. And conceptual designs help get the community excited to go look for funding. My experience is it's really great to have a really good team of landscape architects and engineers, and having them both involved on the front end. This is just a project that I thought I would mention to all of you. This is part of our South Platte River Urban Waters Partnership, and it was called our Natural Capital Resource Assessment. And basically, this was done in the South Platte watershed. It looks at green infrastructure over the whole watershed, dividing the watershed up into the upper watershed, the Denver metro area, and then the plains, and then mapping all of the green infrastructure, and then putting an ecosystem services value on there. And so it helps you decide if you where the best places are to install green infrastructure and where you can get the biggest bang for your buck. And that just sort of shows you the ecosystem service values there. This shows you the natural capital assets, basically the green infrastructure. It's very interesting. You can see forest burn scars in a lot of the area by looking at that. And I just thought I'd mention this as we're closing down here. This is our water quality assessment tool for the Denver metro area. We're in the process of actually upgrading it, but it's trying to make water quality data more accessible to the general public. Rather than using the water quality portal or the Colorado data sharing network, this actually takes some key parameters and makes it easier to understand for the public. We also have a teacher and user guide posted on our South Platte River Urban Waters Partnership webpage for folks to do it. And we're actually in the process, and I'm hoping it will be done by the end of the year. We will be pulling in a lot more data. Right now, the data that we have in there is from 2009 through 2015 for some select pollutants, but we're going to be actually pulling in more current data, and the tool will be dynamic rather than a static tool. And that's pretty much all I have right now. So I really appreciate all of your attention, and I am available if anybody has any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Stacey. Are there any questions? We have a question from Allison. She says, could you talk about the water rights considerations? Is that something that you have knowledge on?
Sure. The Colorado State Engineer's Office has some memos out on this that discusses water rights. Basically, you're allowed to use certain amounts of water that fall onto a site naturally in order to irrigate it. The state legislature actually changed things a couple years ago, so a homeowner can actually have 2 rain barrels. There are some communities that are more remote that can do a little bit more stormwater collection, and there's been some studies down in the Sterling Ranch area that are looking at pre-development runoff versus they're hoping to reuse that stormwater. But it's just something that you have to think about. You can't take large quantities of stormwater and store it somewhere and expect to reuse it. You actually have to follow the rules, to go through all of that. And so it's just something that folks need to think about because it works differently than it does, out on the East Coast. And Colorado also is a little bit different than a lot of other states in how they interpret prior appropriation. But basically, water that would flow into the stream, typically belongs to somebody, and you have senior water rights and junior water rights. And so you have to consider all of that.
Thank you, Stacey. It looks like Allison has a follow-up question, but are you allowed to let it percolate into the swale?
Typically, yes. If it's used for landscaping and you're not trying to hold water. So if you have stormwater retention ponds, typically in stormwater retention ponds, you can only hold it for 72 hours before you are required to release it. But for most landscaping uses and stuff, you are allowed to take that water and infiltrate it, as long as there's not standing water.
Got it. Thank you, Stacey. We really appreciate you coming and joining us today. I think it was a great presentation, and I think some other folks just said it's really inspiring to see what our state, different cities across our state are doing to really make this a priority and an initiative to improve the communities that we all live, work, and play in.
Yeah, I would say that there's a lot of communities in Colorado. I think, we've been a little slower maybe than other parts of the country. I think partly because we have smaller towns and cities. But in addition to the to the city and county of Denver, city of Fort Collins, the city of Boulder's, done a lot of great work. And also one of the documents that I mentioned that the state put out, there's some green infrastructure happening in a lot of smaller communities in areas like Rifle and Aspen, and I'm trying to remember all the other communities that were in there. There's a lot of other good stories in a lot of smaller communities also.
Great. Thank you so much, Stacey. I appreciate it. We still have some more presentations the rest of the day. So for anybody else who's on the call or watching on Facebook, visit PooterRiverFest.org to see the full schedule for the rest of today. And then again, we will be in person, live, seeing other people on August 21st at New Belgium Brewery. So thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.